Okay, so we're back. Let's understand the transition from abstract right to morality. Abstract right was the sphere of the rights of the person based upon maximal abstraction. That's why it's called abstract right. We abstracted from all the particular features of a person and even from his setting purposes, right? So we think of a piece of property normally as existing for, let's say, if it's food, for nourishing the body, or if it's a bit of, if you guys still collect LPs, I see that some people do, for the purpose of listening to music. But abstract right says that any object that one owns has to be looked at from the standpoint of the actualization of the will. And as such, it itself provides the first stage of the actualization of the will, insofar as it makes the will exist in the world. It gives it a field of possibility for actualization, right? So we're going to we're going to abstract from all purpose when thinking about abstract right. That's why it's abstract right. But then when we consider the possibility of crime, that is an individual asserting a right that he does not possess over another individual who does have a right to a certain piece of property, and that means that he does not, that other persons are not allowed to take or use that property without his consent. If someone is to ignore that and simply take or use that property without that person's consent, that's a crime. And then it belongs to the very logic of abstract right that one must uphold it. One has to give perform an action which signifies that the violation of that property right is wrong, and that requires punishment. But now that means that the individual who imposes the punishment has to adopt a purpose. The purpose is that of reinstating, right, and perhaps even reinforcing the sphere of abstract right. It's one of the peculiar features of Hegel's theory that criminals perform an indirect benefit, right? What's the indirect benefit of criminals? They enable persons who oppose crime and more or less act within the law. The criminals enable those persons to recognize the truth in the property rights that they defend through punishing the criminal, right? Do you get that? I mean, the criminal doesn't say, oh, let me give these people an opportunity to punish me so they can appreciate, the truth about property rights. Nonetheless, though he does not intend that, that is objectively what happens. He provides the law-abiding citizens an occasion for that kind of cognition, that kind of knowing. And it's always about knowing, right? It's always about knowing. We're the beings who know. And here we are tracing out how we come to know ourselves in virtue of knowing our rights, right? We come to know ourselves and others, of course, in virtue of knowing our rights and thinking that through. So now we adopt the whole sphere of right as a purpose of the will. That lands us here in the sphere of morality. Okay? Now, by morality, we're not going to spend our time talking about natural law at this point, not in the narrow sense. The entire treatise is about natural law. We'll get back to that. But we're not going to, follow in the footsteps of St. Thomas Aquinas or Thomas Hobbes or Kant or John Stuart Mill, who's a later thinker, but I teach him earlier for a reason. It'll become apparent by the time we're done with Hegel. And like propose our own ethical rule here or something of that sort. That's not what's going to happen. Let's look at how he explains it. He has a peculiar way of understanding the whole sphere of morality. The moral standpoint is the standpoint of the will. Okay, well, we're familiar with that. Not in its abstract or implicit existence, but in its existence for itself, an existence which is infinite. Okay, so existence for itself. The will has made itself explicitly an aim and an end here in the sphere of morality. It's an existence which is infinite. Well, we've seen that the way that the self relates to itself through something else is infinite, right? This is infinite self-relation. This turning back of the will upon itself, or its actual self-identity, with associated phases, stands in contrast to its abstract implicit existence and converts person into subject. All right, so we have different ways we can conceive of ourselves. You can conceive of yourself as a person, that is, as a proprietor, and you can conceive of yourself as a subject. Now, what is a subject? A subject is an individual who sets purposes, right? And we made the transition from person to subject when we realize that a person has to set purposes. It's not enough for a person simply to exercise rights over objects which themselves are, as it were, abstract fields of possibility for the exercise of choice. Choices are choices with purposes, right? We have to make that transition to the subject, and that becomes apparent when we think about the purpose of upholding the whole sphere of abstract right against crime. Oh, hopefully that's clear enough. So on to the next section, 106, subjectivity is a conception made definite, differing therefore from the abstract general will. Further, the will of the subject, though it still retains traces of self-involved simplicity, is the will of an individual who is an object for himself, because this is an individual who's concretely thinking about himself as a responsible subject, and he's trying to bring his consciousness, I'll say it differently, he's trying to bring his acts of will, okay, under a general set of rules and to guide them by values. So I'm sort of anticipating how the whole argument of morality unfolds, but permit me to do this. It gives you the vision of the whole chapter. Here we're considering an individual who is trying to get his principles right and adopt the correct values. You get that? To determine himself in light of norms and values that he can determine to be objectively true. Earlier, we talked about how, in the lectures on the phenomenology I gave you, we talked about how the individual reaches a kind of actualization, right? For German idealism, generally speaking, all the guys who call themselves German idealists, or we call German idealists, when it reaches a kind of actualization in autonomy, when you have a grasp of values and norms which you correctly take to be binding, and then you act on them for that reason, right? That's what's characteristic of the ethically mature individual and the autonomous individual, and that makes for a kind of happy individual. So subjectivity is the realization of this of the conception. This gives, he says conception here, he means begriff. The realization, a begriff, that would be something like man or human being, and then that unfolds into what he calls an idea. You read these conceptual relations in the introduction. The idea is the definition. The human being is a rational animal. That would be the idea relative to the conception. So this gives freedom a higher ground. Now at last there appears in the idea the side of its real existence, the subjectivity of the will. It is only in the will as subjective that freedom or the potentially existing will can be actualized. I think that's easy to appreciate. We can't be free except as persons who set purposes in light of norms and values that we take to be binding on how we conduct ourselves, okay? All right. So here he says a man's worth is estimated by his inner act. By the inner act, right? The inner act relative to one's consciousness of those objective norms and values. And if one acts on an objective norm, because it's an objective norm, right? The inner act has moral merit. It's good, right? So self-determination of will. I say self-determination. Always think about this word determination in Hegel. It has terminus built into it, term, right? A limit. So what's self-determination? Putting yourself on one side or another of a boundary, okay? So you determine what to do. So you have alternatives, and you choose, I'll do this, I'll do that. All right. So self-determination of will, as it is at the same time a factor of the will's conception, subjectivity is not merely the outward reality of the will, but its inner being, right? So we pursue self-determination as an end, right? So that's as an inward matter. Because we think about, okay, you know, I'm a self-determining person. I have to be ethically mature. I'm thinking about that, right? That's a matter of inwardness. So this free and independent will, having now become the will of a subject, and assuming in the first instance the form of the conception, has itself a visible realization. Otherwise, it could not attain to the idea. Moral standpoint is in its realized form the right of the subjective will. Okay, so we want to focus on that. What Hegel's going to say is that the modern individual, as opposed to, you know, the ancient Greek individual particularly, that's one he has in mind. But he would also say, you know, nations like India and China. People don't like the fact he says that. They look upon that nowadays as expressing a kind of imperialist or colonialist attitude or something of that sort. Yeah, I'm not going to try to defend Hegel against the charge of Eurocentrism. I once attended a talk, and the title of the talk was, is Hegel Eurocentric? And he said, well, the question is sort of like asking, is the Pope Catholic, right? Or at least it was like asking it at that time. The current Pope is not Catholic. Interestingly, he rejects several articles of the Catholic faith. It's very interesting. But in the old days, that was a joke, right? Is the Pope Catholic? Is Hegel Eurocentric? Yeah, he's Eurocentric. Okay, so we'll have to deal with that. That's just way to take that as a fact. It is what it is. The moral standpoint is, in its realized form, the right of the subjective will. Okay, the right to be an individual, folks. We'll get further into that. In accordance with this right, the will recognizes and is a thing only insofar as the thing is the will's own, and the will in it, and the will in it, the thing, is itself and subjective. Okay, maybe that doesn't bear too much comment. Move it forward here. Children have no moral will, but are guided by their parents, as he said, right? Being shaped. So the subjective will. Now, there's always this difference between the subjective and the objective, right? The subjective will, insofar as it is directly its own object and distinct from the general will, is abstract, limited, and formal. Subjectivity, however, is not formal merely, but since it is the infinite self-direction of the will, is the will itself taken formally. Okay, by formally we mean generally and abstractly. Since this formal character, as it appears first of all in the particular will, is not as yet identical with the conception of will, the moral standpoint is the standpoint of relation, of obligation or requirement. So, I mean, I know his language is difficult. It's not yet identical, right? This formal character of the will, it's not yet identical with the fullest conception of the will unfolded in its to its full actualization. So it takes the standpoint of a relation. That is, the will is not actualized. The will simply is conscious of an obligation. I suppose acting on the obligation successfully and knowing that you've done so, right? That would be a higher stage of actualization. Since too subjectivity involves difference, that is to say opposition to objectivity as to a mere external existence, there arises here also the standpoint of consciousness, the standpoint of difference in general and of the finite and phenomenal phase of the will. Okay, so what's the standpoint of consciousness? That's the standpoint in which the individual faces external objects and takes himself to be a single individual opposed to objects. So this is the individual who takes himself somehow to enjoy a kind of independence of the various groups of which he is a member. One group would be the family, obviously. A second would be the business for which you work. A third would be the state. And of course, we have two meanings of state here in the U.S. Rhode Island is a state, and technically speaking, we don't speak this way, but technically speaking, each of us is a citizen of Rhode Island, correct? I'm just assuming you guys are Rhode Island residents. Like we do have people from Massachusetts and Connecticut driving in for whatever reason. Maybe they work here and then they just take a class here too. That's true. And then we have citizenship in the Federal Republic of the United States of America, which in my opinion now no longer exists. Why did I say that? Because, well, one day I'll explain that. The formal will, by its own determining character, contains at the outset the opposition of subjectivity and objectivity and the appropriate activity. Okay? So that's pretty clear. I mean, there's your subjective sphere in which you are conscious of norms and values, and you are determining yourself to act relative to a range of alternatives. You evaluate the alternatives in light of those norms and values. And there's objectivity in a couple of different senses, what you confront outside of yourself but also the objectivity of the norms and values. Objectivity appears within subjectivity, correct? And by the way, the objectivity without yourself, outside of yourself, those things that you encounter in situations and states of affairs you encounter outside of yourself impinge upon your subjectivity and appear in that subjectivity, right? So even that exteriority appears in the interior space. So of this will, we have these further phases. Concrete realization and determinate character are in the conception identical. The conception of the subjective will is first to make these two phases separate and independent, and then to establish them as identical. Okay. Determinate character in the self-determined will, alpha, that's a Greek character, there's alpha. Determinate character in the self-determined will is brought about in itself by itself. The opposition which it creates within itself being a self-bestowed content. This is the first negation whose formal limit consists in its being fixed as merely subjective. So at first you determine a certain character inwardly through an act of will. Since the will returns into itself and is infinite, this limit exists for it, and it wills to transcend the limitation. Okay, it's obviously choice. It's not simply a matter of an inward act of will. It's an inward act of will which essentially expresses itself in action. Hence, it strives to convert its content out of subjectivity into objectivity. That is some kind of directly given reality. So gamma, the simple identity of the will with itself in this opposition, is the content, which maintains itself amid these oppositions. Okay, so inwardly one faces a series of alternatives. One selects one in light of an objective norm or value and returns to oneself. Remember this, the old structure of return of consciousness returning to itself out of its other. It returns to itself through determining one of those alternatives as that it will act on in light of the objective norms and values that it uses to determine its choice. And precisely as such, it's something that gets expressed outwardly in reality. Okay, so the simple identity of the will with itself in this opposition is the content, right? That choice of the alternative, which maintains itself amid these oppositions and is indifferent to formal distinctions. This content is the purpose or end. So ultimately, one chooses to do something by some means, right? He didn't say that, but that's implied. If you choose an end, then you choose a means to that end. Okay? So as the moral standpoint, freedom or self-identity of will is for the will. The simple identity of the content or end receives a further characteristic peculiar to itself. This content becomes mine in such a way that it, in its identity, is not only my inner end, but also as far as it is externally realized, contains for me my subjectivity. I mean, the aim that you pursue, of course, you are conscious of the aim or the end, and then you realize it in the world, and you're exteriorizing your subjectivity. That's a way of thinking about that. You're making your subjectivity exist in the world by changing the world. This is why Hegel talks about finding oneself at home in the world. How do you find yourself at home in the world? By changing the world and then recognizing that it bears the traces of your actions and your thoughts. Okay, 111b. The content, though it contains something particular from whatever source it comes, is yet the content of a self-referring will, which is also self-identical and universal. Well, self-identical is obvious. It's a self-identical will. And insofar as it's a will, well, there are multiple instantiations of the will. And even if there were only one person, it would be possible that there would be other persons with a will, so it's universal. So thus it has these two features. A, it aims to be in itself adequate to the universal will, or to have the objectivity of the conception. Okay, that simply means that at the level of morality, one makes a positive goal for oneself of being a fully actualized will, and a fully actualized will in accordance with what's universal concerning the will. What's universal concerning the will? The norms and values that are actually binding on a will as a will. Those are universal. They're binding on everyone. And one aims to, insofar as one has a will, let's put it this way. insofar as one has a will, the will itself, whatever you're thinking, the will itself is oriented towards, it's ordered to, it's related to those objective norms and values that adhere to would enable the will's full actualization. Okay? Yet, since the subjective will exists for itself and is therefore independent and formal, its aim is only an ought, and is possibly not adequate to this conception. So that's a criticism for Hegel. When he says something is a mere ought, he means it's unrealizable. I made that point much earlier. What ought to be is exactly that which you can orient yourself towards, but you can't achieve. It's that which you can take steps towards, but you can't realize the aim or end of those steps. Okay. So I preserve my subjectivity in accomplishing my ends, yet the objectification of these ends I pass beyond the simple and elementary subjectivity, which is merely my own. Okay. This new external subjectivity, which is identical with me, is the will of others. Aha! So one encounters others, right? And in encountering others, one enters into distinctively moral relations with them. And one judges their actions and they judge yours, right? There's a mutual evaluation. We'll get into that more deeply when we get deeper into this argument. The sphere for the existence of the will is subjectivity, and the will of others is the existence which, though other than I yet give to my purpose. Hence, the accomplishment of my purpose contains the identity of my will and that of others, and has to the will of others a relation which is positive. Okay, so it is possible to enter into a collective purpose, is it not? It's also possible to adopt a purpose, and it's somehow dutiful to adopt a purpose that one could say others should adopt if that person in question, if another person were to find himself in a situation sufficiently similar to my own, right? So if somebody else finds himself or herself in a situation sufficiently similar, somebody else is there, to find themselves in a situation sufficiently similar to my own, the person ought to do what I do. I mean, that's what's implied in acting reasonably. If you're a reasonable person, you think that what you're doing is reasonable, that other persons in similar circumstances ought to act reasonably as well. That means do more or less what you're doing. Okay, so we can skip the note here. The fact I skip notes and additions does not mean they're useless. You should read them, but I can't comment on everything. So 113, the expression of the subjective or moral will is action. Of course, of action it may be said that alpha, I know its external fulfillment to be mine. Beta, it is essentially related to the conception in its phase as the ought or imperative. And gamma, it is essentially connected with the will of others. Okay. How's it connected with the will of others? That's maybe, it's open to their evaluation. Okay. Okay, so the right of the moral will has three factors. The abstract or formal right, that's the act as directly realized is to be in its essential content mine and embody the purpose of the subjective will. Okay, so this is a very important part of Hegel's theory. An action, insofar as the action of a modern subject, that is a moral subject, is something that belongs to his subjective will in some peculiar way. Okay, and we'll get back to that. The ancients didn't think this way. The ancients, they would recognize that certain things you did that were your actions, right? Even though you didn't intend them. Okay, we can get back to that. So the specific side of an act or its inner content, alpha, this is intention, which is for me, whose general character is fixed, the value and inner substance of the act. And its well-being, where the content taken is the particular end of my particular subjective reality. C, the good or the content taken is universal, and exalted to universality and absolute objectivity. That's the third stage. This is the absolute end of the will. That's what I was talking about. Objective norms and values is what he's talking about there. Okay. All right. So let's get back to abstract and formal right here. Notice how that sounds like abstract right. That's not an accident. That's being taken up here. So purpose and responsibility. Okay, so in the direct or immediate act, the subjective will is finite, since it has to do with both an external object and its varied surroundings, all presupposed. An accomplished act makes a change in this ready-to-hand material. The will is responsible insofar as the changed material can be said to be mine. So you have a right of what you might call the right of purpose. What is the right of purpose? The right to be held responsible only for what you actually purpose. If you don't purpose it, then we shouldn't say that you're responsible for it, right? So his example is Oedipus, the king. Oedipus Tyrannos. It's actually not even a Greek word, but the Greeks used Tyrannos, right? Tyrant. The Greeks had a negative attitude towards all monarchs, by the way, so they thought of all of them as tyrants, but that's not an important feature of the Oedipus story. Oedipus was passing through a pass in a mountain and ran into a fellow who treated him very rudely, so he killed him. Matter of fact, the other guy was a bully, and it was probably would have killed Oedipus had Oedipus not defended himself and then struck the other fellow down. Turns out that was his father. He didn't find this out till much later. He then makes his way to a place called Thebes, and outside of Thebes, he encountered a creature of uncanniness and horror that we call the Sphinx, right? But when you think of something like this, you're to think of as soon as you approach it, you begin being filled with a heavy feeling of dread. The air becomes fetid, right? You begin losing your orientation. Your thoughts become unclear, right? You feel like you're being crushed to death, right? So, I mean, it's one of these mystical animals. But Oedipus is no slouch. I mean, Oedipus is a great hero, right? And so he confronts the Sphinx, and it tells you something important about Oedipus, that he doesn't just chop the head of the Sphinx off or something of that sort. Had he tried that, it probably wouldn't have worked, right? But the Sphinx posed him a riddle that it posed to everyone who walked along that road, and he solved the riddle, right? And the Sphinx slinked away, because that was a condition. If you can't solve the riddle, the Sphinx eats you. If you do, the Sphinx will leave, and it left. But for that, he earned the right to become king of that city, because that city had no king. He became king of Thebes. But it had a queen. That's the difficulty. So he married the queen. Turns out that was his mother. Okay. So you figure, ladies got married at a relatively young age at that time. So maybe she gave birth to Oedipus when she was 16 or so, right? And now he's a buff young guy of 22, and his mother's 38, right? Well, healthy 38-year-old woman can still bear a few kids. So they have a bunch. So do you blame Oedipus? I mean, he didn't know it was his dad. He didn't know his mom. Today, do we hold him responsible? No, we don't. No, we don't, right? And there's even some wrestling if you look at Sophocles, there's even some wrestling with this idea. He said, I didn't really mean to do any of that. And yet he's guilty. That's the Greek attitude. If you kill your dad and marry your mom, or your dad, or you kill your mom and marry your dad, even if you don't know what you did, you're still guilty. Why? Because your purposes and intentions don't really matter for the determination of guilt. You violated the objective order of nature. You guys get that? If you violate the order of nature, you've violated the order of nature, and that's that. You're guilty. And it's fit that you then spend the rest of your life wandering, the countryside, or wandering from city to city, begging for your keep. That was the fate of Oedipus, of course. Some other examples here for you. I mean, what if you went into the Amazon rainforest? There are still, what do they call them? Uncontacted groups, something to that effect. There are groups in the Amazon. I mean, they're so aggressive that every time anyone attempts to contact them, they shoot poison darts at you and they kill somebody. And so people just, they don't bother. So there are a bunch of 30 or 40 uncontacted groups. And once in a while, one or another of them decides to make contact with us, or at least people in industrial society, as it were, right? Let's say you approach one of those groups, and well, no, how about this? Let's say you're walking through the woods, and you don't know one of those groups is around, and you step on their sacred ground, right? You put your foot on their sacred ground where their ancestors' bones are laid. Of course, for them, the penalty for that is the death penalty. So, I mean, so if one of them shows up, what do you say? Oh, no, you can't shoot me. I didn't mean it, and I have I have a natural right to life. So, right, they shoot you with a poison dart, you're gone. So their attitude would be, you violated the natural order. Well, how about this? Should one be held responsible for one's parents' wrongdoing? So if one's parent gets a lot of credit card debt, even buying one gifts, right? But if the parent has $100,000 of credit card debt and the parent passes on, should the child inherit that, right? It's not that it wasn't the child's action, right? Do you see how moderns think about this? If the child or the person didn't intend to step on the sacred ground, if the person is not the individual who did the deed of the parent in running up the credit cards, right? The person's not responsible. How about collective responsibility too? I mean, the ancients in the Bible, there are passages which indicate a certain conception of collective responsibility. So if you are a member of a group, the group has done evil things, you benefit from the evil things the group has done, smashing neighboring tribes, so on and so forth, and putting their end to the sword and taking their stuff and enslaving their women and children. Even if all that happened when you were a baby, you still benefited from it, and you're guilty, right? That's an ancient attitude. And of course, we today say, no, that's not true. Maybe we can talk about something like reparations. If you're talking about reparations to the persons that you've oppressed, then you are making babies responsible for it. You are, by the way, right? So maybe if people are talking that way, they are talking that way. Then maybe we're returning to an ancient attitude now, which is interesting. So Hegel looks at all those, collective responsibility. And he'll bring collective responsibility back later, but a kind of crude conception of collective responsibility. Inherited responsibility. He's not much on original sin, Hegel. Okay. Inherited responsibility and violations of the natural order. These things he thinks are empty. They're structurally defective, and we need to recognize the freedom of the person. We should hold a person responsible merely for what he purposes, she purposes, right? The person. So when the self-directing will proposes to act upon a given material, it has a representation of the circumstances. And since the material is supplied, the will is finite, and the results of the act are for it accidental. We can probably, I do want to finish this. Hence, they might contain something very different from the representation. But the right of the will in acting is to recognize as its own deed, right? Only those results which were consciously in its end and were purposed. Okay, this is what I call the right of purpose, or what he calls the right of knowledge. It's follow Hegel. It's the right of knowledge. That responsibility shall extend only to the will, shall extend to the world only so far as the results were known. This is the right of knowledge. You have the right to know what you intended to do, and be held responsible merely for what you knew what you were doing. Okay, so that rules out Oedipus. It rules out your dad, and he gives you the Oedipus example here, and of collective responsibility, at least a certain model of collective responsibility. An act, when it has become an external reality and is connected with a very outer necessity, has manifold consequences. He goes out and makes this point more or less again, but then he shifts the vocabulary to talk about intentions. So we'll skip ahead here. What's the difference between a purpose and an intention? A purpose, he's still talking about Oedipus. A purpose is literally the action you intend to do. The intention is that for the sake of which you choose to do it. Okay? So there you are. So that's what we'll get into there. I'm going to skip some sections here so we can make this manageable. So he says you have a right to be a right of intention, right? That complements. It's sort of like the flip side of your right of knowledge. You have the right to know what it is that you purpose and to be held responsible merely for that which you knew what you were doing. And the right of intention is the right to be held responsible precisely for the as for the overall aim of what you did. So you might choose to hold a torch to a door. It's literally your purpose to hold this torch to the door, but your intention is to burn down the house, right? And that would be obviously a morally bad thing to do, unless one has an excellent reason to burn down a house. So the right of intention is that the universal quality of the act should not only be implicitly present, but should be known by the agent. Okay, so these are two sides of one coin. You know, the right of knowledge, or the right of purpose, as I like to call it, is that has to do with the means, really, right? The action, which is a means to what you intend to achieve through that means, and that's the aim, which you intend. All right, let's move it forward here. I think we can go straight to 124, which is what we're going to do. Okay. By the way, so I mean, 123 has some interesting stuff there. So 123, the note is helpful. This is the standpoint of relation. The subject at this stage emphasizes his distinctive and particular nature. Here enters the content of the natural will. What's the natural will, guys? Remember those drives, impulses, and things of that sort. But the will is not in its simple and direct form, since the content belongs to a will, which is turned back into itself and raised to the level of a universal end, namely well-being or happiness. Okay, so then we have those two stages. Remember, you aim, not aim, but you have aims delivered to you, right, through impulses and drives and inclinations. It's the natural will, and then you prioritize. Then you end up aiming at happiness. Okay, but look what happens in the next section. Very important. Okay, this is a very important section. Note to yourself, 124 is really important. Since the subjective satisfaction of the individual, the recognition, for example, of oneself as honored or famous, is involved in the realization of absolutely valid ends, the demand that only subjective satisfaction should appear as willed and attained, and also the view that in action subjective and objective ends exclude one another, are empty assertions of the abstract understanding. Okay, so Hegel's grammar is very difficult to follow at times, but I think we can make this out without too much difficulty. People say, well, everyone achieves satisfaction when they realize their aim, right? And then they make an invalid inference, because everyone achieves satisfaction when they realize their aim. They say, okay, therefore, everyone aims at satisfaction. Those are two different things, okay? Aiming at satisfaction is one thing. Achieving satisfaction which piggybacks on the realization of some other aim, which is different from satisfaction, that's another thing. So you might aim at providing an enjoyable afternoon to a group of children in a cancer ward, right? And then when you do it, you bring a guitar and some stories, and you give these kids a great time, and you leave feeling satisfied. You leave feeling satisfied because you did satisfy your will, right? That doesn't mean you aimed at being satisfied. You might not have thought about satisfaction at all the entire afternoon. You were thinking about the kids because you like kids. You get me? So when people realize their aim, they are satisfied. It doesn't mean that they aim at satisfaction. Big difference. People make that mistake all the time. It says, nay, more, the argument becomes a positive evil when it is held that because subjective satisfaction is always found in every finished work, it must be the essential intention of the agent, like what I said, the objective end being only a means for the attainment of this satisfaction. The subject of the series of his acts, if these are a series of worthless productions, the subjectivity of the will is also worthless. You might emphasize that. Sometimes people say, oh, Hegel is a great thinker of human dignity. He believes in the intrinsic goodness of the person, right? Look what he says. If one does a series of worthless things, one leads a life that's selfish and frivolous and shallow and harmful. The subjectivity of the will is also worthless. So if the subjectivity of the will is worthless, my friends, the person is worthless from Hegel's point of view. So he's not a thinker in the department of the intrinsic dignity of the human being. Kant was there, right? But Kant's a peculiar thinker, you know. He's dominant in a way, and people do follow him. He seems to be lurking about the halls of the United Nations. I mean, his way of thinking about things, with all these UN resolutions. Hegel is not one of those guys. So you are what you make yourself into. So if the acts are substantial and sound, so likewise is the inner will of the individual. Now the note here is really important, so we're going to have a look at this. So the right of the subject's particular being to find himself satisfied. Okay, that's it. You see, it's not that you aim at satisfaction in everything you do. Nonetheless, you are satisfied when you achieve your aim. And that correlates with this. This is another idea. You have a right to pursue your satisfaction. So the right of the subject's particular being to find himself satisfied, the right, in other words, of subjective freedom, constitutes the middle or turning point between the ancient and the modern world. So what he means by here, he does not mean that we have a right to a universal basic income, right? He's not saying that somehow other people have a duty to make sure you're satisfied. That's not what he's talking about at all. But you do have the right to pursue satisfaction, and to, even though it's the case you're not always making satisfaction your aim, you have the right to make satisfaction your aim. That is, you have the right to set up your happiness as an aim. That has two implications here, guys. It means you have the right to choose the end of your life, your own scheme of prioritizations, okay? Some of you will rank listening to jazz quite high. Others of you will not rank it at all. Just keep it off your list. You have also the right to choose the means to the realization of happiness. Okay, so you want to go and become someone who works in the sonogram technology or something of that sort. I understand that's a pretty safe. That's one of the areas in the health care sector that's relatively safe, because the sonogram supposedly doesn't harm anybody. I don't know. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but they say it doesn't. So, very good. You choose the means and the end in your pursuit of satisfaction. We're looking at a modern individual here, right? What else are the means? Not only your career, where you live, who you marry, and so on and so forth, right? So look what he says about this. This right in its infinite nature is expressed in Christianity and has been made the universal active principle of a new form of the world. The more definite manifestations of this principle are love, romance, the hope of the eternal salvation of the individual, morality also, and conscience. It includes, moreover, various other forms which will be, in a measure, introduced in the sequel as the principle of civic society. Okay, very good. So this is the individual who stands for us as an individual. If you like, a kind of, maybe heroic individual is too strong a way of putting it, but an autonomous individual, an individual who determines the basic elements of his or her life in the pursuit of happiness, and this person conceives of happiness in accordance with his own or her own peculiar scheme of prioritizations. Okay, this is beginning to look familiar. All right, so let's move this along here. Again, he takes the view of the psychological valet for whom there are no heroes, not because there are no heroes, but because he is only a valet. I mean, so the idea that Hegel thinks that everybody has some high dignity is ridiculous. So, let's see. The subjective concerns with the particular content of well-being is when it becomes infinite by being turned back into itself, at the same time brought into relation with implicit or general will. So what he's going to get at here is that there's a general right of well-being. That means everyone has a right of well-being in the sense that every other person ought to take into account that other people are pursuing happiness or well-being. And you have to take that into account when you're making your own plans. You can't discount that. You count your own well-being as an important aim or end. And you account it important significantly because it expresses your choice. And the act of free choice is regarded as somehow conferring importance on what is chosen. Do you get that? The act of free choice confers some kind of meaning on what is chosen, some kind of importance on what is chosen. Okay. But if your act of free choice can do that, Well, your active choice, I don't have the section number, but you read it up a little earlier. Your active free choice is the same, formally speaking, as somebody else's active free choice. Numerically, they're not the same. You know, yours is your act, that other person's is his act, but formally, they're the same thing. And it's in virtue of the form that your active free choice confers meaning upon what you choose, okay? So the other individual participates in the same form, right, so to speak. So it's in virtue of that form that his active choice confers meaning on what he does. So the very ground, your well-being, something of importance. And Hegel thinks it makes it of genuine importance. This is not like subjectivism. The fact that you choose well-being or happiness as his name, that does make it important in his estimation. But somebody else also chooses his own particular scheme of well-being or happiness. That makes it important for him. And it's the very same thing which makes each important. So you're bound to respect his pursuit of happiness. He's bound to respect yours. Okay. So skip things along here. He talks about the theft of a loaf of bread. You know, freedom is so important that in a situation of exigency, of necessity, an individual can steal a loaf of bread. You have a child, the child's hungry and sick, and you're afraid the child hasn't eaten for a day or two. You're afraid that the child's going to die. And you don't have any money, and you don't have any credits from the welfare program or anything of that sort. You're broke, and you went out panhandling, and no one gave you anything, right? So, and the kid's going to die unless the kid eats. So, in that particular case, in order to preserve the freedom of the child, one has a right to take somebody else's property, steal a loaf of bread. You know, the proverbial loaf of bread cooling on the windowsill. Some of you are saying, well, it takes a lot of effort to make a loaf of bread, and that loaf of bread may be owned by a poor family. That may be their only loaf of bread, right? So on and so forth. So, I mean, that would impose upon the actor, the agent, a duty, right? A duty to evaluate the situation carefully and not steal the last loaf of bread owned by some very poor family that is in a house but is in danger of being evicted, so on and so forth, okay? So he calls that the right of exigency, E-X-I-G-E-N-C-Y, E-X-I-G-E-N-C-Y, exigency. Okay. Now, you're pursuing well-being. This whole chapter is sort of a recapitulation of those central sections of the introduction where we talked about all this. Now, you move from having purposes and intentions to pursuing happiness, but that all has to be understood in light of the good. Because the will takes as its aim its own actualization. And happiness can include extrinsic elements, which could cause the will to will its own subordination to something distinct from its own actualization. Like, for example, if you really like listening to Miles Davis, one might mistakenly, it would be a mistake. For Hegel, it would be a logical mistake, right, to elevate the experience of listening to Miles Davis over the actualization of your will. You guys get that? You might say, oh, no, that is the actualization of my will. I chose to do that. Well, one can choose things which don't adequately actualize one's will. There are different ways of exercising one's will, right? And simply to exercise it is not to fully actualize it. There are you can steal something, right? That's an exercise of the will, and that's a kind of de-actualization of the will. And in that case, you're ejecting yourself from the community of mutual recognition, which is a step in the wrong direction. Now, I think we can probably bring this to a quick conclusion. I mean, the good and conscience. The whole aim here is to determine yourself to act in light of an adequate and fully objective conception of what is good. And you'll determine what is good in light of your conscience. Okay? What gets included? Abstract right and well-being, property rights, and the rights of others upon you for you to consider their well-being as an end. I mean, that means not only are you not to interfere in illicit ways with their pursuit of well-being, you're to help them. Okay, and Hegel deliberately leaves that pretty open-ended because it has to be open-ended, right? We can't give one another detailed instructions on how we're supposed to help other people. Depends on the circumstances, but we're supposed to help. Okay, what else is in there? The subjectivity of consciousness and the contingency of external reality. These are in their independent and separate existences, superseded in this unity, although in their real essence they were contained and preserved. So, in this idea, well-being has value not independently as the realization of the separate particular will, but only as a universal well-being, as universal, that is, in its essence intrinsically or in accordance with freedom. Okay, so fiat justia ought not to have periat mundus as a consequent. Okay, let justice be, even at the expense of the world. Let the world perish. That doesn't fit. Okay, well, there has to be some kind of balance between the respect for property rights and the concern for the well-being of others. That's our big debate over the last 150 years or so, right? The question of welfare. How much taxation is justifiable for the sake of benefiting those who are less advantaged? Okay. So a guy like John Rawls says quite a lot. All right. So other persons say no, not at all. Look at the work of Robert Nozick, N-O-Z-I-C-K. He's very much worth looking at for a very sharp thinker. I mentioned John Rawls. Everybody reads him. R-A-W-L-S. Okay. Not my favorite thinker, but obviously he's the most important political philosopher of the past 50 years. He kind of single-handedly rehabilitated political philosophy in North America. He did do that, so I give him credit for that. And then Robert Nozick quickly scored a punch, as it were, against Rawls a few years later with his Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which is worth reading. So the subjective will finds in the good the supremely essential and has worth and merit only as its insight and intention accord with the good. So here's the whole difficulty. This section is not difficult to understand. Namely, that if the moral will is going to actualize itself as a moral will, what it's aiming to do is to realize itself as a being who acts on objective norms and values, which it has formulated through its own effort, okay? Which it has, as it were, formulated and certified as objective, without having any recourse to tradition. Dad, I'm sick of your speeches. I'm going to figure things out for myself, right? That's the standpoint of moral subjectivity. I'm going to actualize myself. Every single person has to think for himself, right? That's what's going on in the sphere of morality. It's that distinctively modern sphere. You have to understand that 98% of human experience is at odds with what we're talking about here. 90%, whatever it is. Some large, substantial part of human experience does not agree with the standpoint of morality, which maintains that tradition is nothing. What matters is the individual, the self. Later on, they'll say the self-reliant individual, with Thoreau and people like that, and the transcendentalists. The self-reliant individual, Emerson. Self-determining individual, the individual who should determine the supreme values for himself and then act on them. Okay. Others say no, it's a complete disaster. You have to situate yourself in a tradition, and the tradition itself and your participation in the tradition will make you free. The tradition exists so that you can be free. The idea of your being able to bootstrap yourself up to freedom is totally insane. Okay, so Hegel's closer to this this criticism. So notice that it's right in the middle. The section on morality is in the middle of the book. That means it's not the complete stage of the actualization of the will. So in abstract right, we have the idea of an individual as a proprietor with property. In morality, we have the idea of the individual as determining for himself what the human good is. What Hegel's going to say is, this is a problem, because how is he going to think about it? How will he determine what the human good is? Problem is that he'll rely upon his conscience. And you've noticed that some people feel that one proposition is true and they feel it in their bones, and somebody else feels the exact opposite to be true in their bones. In the U.S., we're full of these oppositions, and now we're killing one another on behalf of them. So there's pro-life and pro-choice, and people can't agree, and they won't agree because there are different metaphysical worldviews behind the two choices, as I've said a couple of times here. Okay, but they feel it in their bones, and it's a matter of conscience, right? The conscience brings things down to its foundation here. But that means one person's conscience points him in one direction, another person's conscience points him in a different direction. And the two directions are mutually contradictory. But they're both based on the same principle ultimately. Formally, it's the same thing. It's conscience. You follow me? Okay. So this whole idea that one can actualize the will through conscience is a contradiction. You can't actualize yourself through recourse to a principle that itself produces contradictions. Conscience produces contradictions. You guys follow me? Some people develop, their conscience tells them one thing at the age of 20, and then they do some reading and some thinking and some living. And by the age of 40, their conscience tells them the opposite. Okay? So conscience is not, it's indispensable, right? But it's not adequate for the actualization of the will. It's just not going to work. So what he says is, now think about this. This is the sphere of the full actualization of the will, right? So what he says is, towards the end of this chapter, I'll just kind of go down there while I talk, is that the moral subject aims at complete self-consciousness of the ground of his action, right? So what's the consequence of that? If somebody thinks this through all the way, he'll perceive the emptiness of conscience. Right, there it is. You want to get the section on conscience, 136 here. So the person who thinks this all the way through is going to recognize the insufficiency of conscience to determine the good. And so what he'll do at first, right, is, as Hegel says, become an ironist. Now, an ironist makes a choice. Every time you act, you make a choice which prioritizes something, right? So let's say you say, I don't know what to do. I don't know. Yeah, I'll just do this. I'll just make this choice at random. The fact you're making the choice at all, that itself indicates a kind of objective preference. But what the ironist does is he holds himself at a distance from the preference which is embedded in the choice. You can't make a choice without preferring something. It's just built into choosing. But the ironist says, yeah, but what I chose is not important. So he chooses it and then instantly negates it. He says this is important and this is not important, right? He negates it immediately with his irony. That means he effectively negates all value. Now, why does he do that? Because he says it's all arbitrary. It's all a matter of conscience. Who cares about anything? I don't care. Yeah, you folks know anyone like that? He says, oh boy, I just don't care one way or the other because it just doesn't matter. You can go one way or the other. Who cares? I'd rather just kind of hang out down here in my parents' basement and play video games. By the way, they're choosing that. They're asserting that is good. You can't get out of that. Okay. So what's wrong with the ironist? What's wrong with the ironist is that he's a murderer of all that is good and beautiful and true. It all disappears. We have this kind of false notion of what, or at least limited notion of what evil is. For us, evil is some psychotic in a film killing, dozens of people. No, Hegel says if we showed him one of those films, he'd say, well, he'd probably be very upset by the fact that we make films like those. He would say that's a kind of cartoon depiction of evil. I mean, that maybe that happens. There's occasionally some psychotic, but evil at its root is a person negating the very idea of the good. That's evil. The ironist. Someone like this who says, well, nothing really matters. For Hegel, that's evil at its ripest. Okay. Then he might point out that if that exists, then sooner or later that'll morph into psychotics, killing people, so on and so forth. But at its root, there are individuals who deny that there are any values at all. Today we call this nihilism. Person who says that all distinctions between good and bad are merely apparent. None of them have any basis in fact. None of them have any basis in fact, right? I don't know what's going on out there. A little excitement. Um, so that for Hegel is evil itself. That is evil itself. So how do we get out of it? Well, we have to return to exactly to what we negated before, and that is ultimately tradition. And here he does talk about evil here, right? 139, that's where he spells out what I just said. We have to return to tradition, but tradition realizing rational institutions. Not just any old tradition will do. There are bad traditions in Hegel's estimation. I score easy points when I mentioned the Aztecs. They would take kids up to the top of the temple, 13, 14-year-old kid, plunge a knife into the kid's chest, rip out the heart, eat the heart, skin the kid, put the skin on. It was like a horror film. So that was a bad tradition. Okay, it had that going on for a while. It's a very bad tradition. So you're not, it's not politically correct to say that Cortez did a good thing in snuffing that out. Well, the people surrounding the Aztecs didn't like the fact they were killing their kids. Okay, so this was kind of a tag team effort, Cortez with the surrounding tribes. You can quote me. I'm all for it. I'm all for snuffing out the Aztec practice of human sacrifice and eating the hearts of teenage kids. If that makes me somehow not politically correct, I don't want to be politically correct. Here I am. It's on recording too. You can take this, put it on YouTube if you like. So interesting stuff here, guys. The origin of evil in general lies in the mystery, right? The speculative process of freedom. How do people end up there? By the way, I mean, when you think about it, that irony, he says, what I call nihilism, but that irony, that means you distance yourself from what you've chosen. That's already built into reflective endorsement. Remember that? You reflectively endorse your choice. But there are two ways of doing that. You can there are two ways of having distance relative to what you've chosen. You can reflectively endorse what you chose, or you can reflectively negate what you chose, or the second one's irony. Okay. All right. So I think that's probably good for now. Why don't we stop there? We'll talk about, I'll get another recording on ethical life up. So I know this one's coming late, but it's fine because this leads into ethical life very well. And you see, I can't comment on everything. If I did, it would be a 20-hour commentary, right? And you guys don't need that. You wouldn't listen to it anyway. So let's pause this and let you guys listen to it, and then I will do another one for you. And have a very happy and blessed Thanksgiving.